Tonight, I want to talk about impunity in America. With the election of President Obama, the problem of torture has not, as most of us had hoped, simply disappeared, wiped away by new executive orders, striking all of those unfortunate orders of President Bush from the record. Instead, it has now entered a particularly disturbing, a particularly sordid phase called impunity. And if you'll bear with me for 20 minutes, I'll try and explain to you how we got there. To explain how and why this tragic past is still very much a part of our political present, let me offer a short history of psychological torture divided into 5 parts: discovery, development, propagation, legalization, and impunity. Part 1, discovery. On April 28, 2004, Americans were stunned when CBS television broadcast those now notorious photographs from Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison showing hooded Iraqis stripped naked as U.S. soldiers stood by smiling. As this scandal grabbed headlines around the globe, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld insisted the abuses were perpetrated by, quote, a small number of U.S. military. William Safire, conservative New York Times columnist, quickly branded these soldiers as creeps. These soldiers shown in that photo, however, were simple instruments of a larger policy. These photos were not, however, snapshots of simple brutality or a breakdown in military discipline. Take, for example, that most iconic of all those photos showing a hooded Iraqi with electrical wires hanging from his arms. This photo, in my reading, shows not the sadism of a few creeps, but instead the 2 key trademarks of the CIA's psychological torture paradigm. The hood is for sensory deprivation. The arms are extended for self-inflicted pain. It is that simple. It is that obvious. In short, this photo is a snapshot of a distinctively American form of torture, psychological torture. Viewed historically, the Abu Ghraib scandal is the product of a deeply contradictory U.S. policy toward torture that developed at the start of the Cold War back in the 1950s. Back then, publicly at the United Nations, Washington spoke out loud and strong and clear in opposition to torture, advocating a universal standard of human rights. Simultaneously and secretly, however, the CIA began developing and propagating ingenious new torture techniques in contravention of those same diplomatic conventions. From 1950 to 1962, the CIA led a secret research effort to crack the code of human consciousness, a veritable Manhattan Project of the mind with costs that reach at peak $1 billion a year. Now, during this first decade of research, CIA mind control moved through 2 distinct phases. First, a bungled, disastrous, in-house CIA exploration of exotic techniques such as hypnosis and hallucinogenic drugs. Then later, a focus on more mundane behavioral experimentation that was subcontracted outside the agency to some of the most brilliant behavioral scientists of their generation. Now, while this agency drug testing led nowhere, the CIA funded behavioral experiments outsourced to the country's leading universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and others, produced 2 key findings that contributed to the discovery of psychological torture. Discovery number 1, which we saw in this film, sensory deprivation. In the early 1950s, famed Canadian psychologist Dr. Donald Hebb, who is in many accounts the author of the modern cognitive scientific revolution. Google Hebb and you get 300,000 to 400,000 hits. He discovered that he could induce a state akin to psychosis in just 48 hours. Now, what had the doctor done? Drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, psychological surgery? No, none of the above. For 2 days, student volunteers at McGill University, where Dr. Hebb was chair of psychology, simply sat in a comfortable air-conditioned cubicle, deprived of sensory stimulation by goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. If you look at the sketches and the photographs of those students, they look very much like those Guantanamo detainees that we saw in that film, and for good reason. Dr. Hebb himself reported that after just 2 or 3 days of such isolation, quote, the subject's very identity had begun to disintegrate. Discovery number 2, self